Welcome to the session on America's Unmet Promise and the Equity Imperative. I am Tia McNair, the Senior Director for Student Success at AAC&U. I am joined by my colleagues, Dr. Estela Bensimon, Professor of Higher Education and Co-Director of the Center for Urban Education in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. She makes me say all of that. Dr. Daniel Greenstein, the Director of Education Postsecondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Ms. Susan Johnson, the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Lumina Foundation. So we all know the importance of this topic. You heard Carol talk about it. It's our centennial theme on equity and the equity imperative as we move forward through this year. And as part of AAC&U's LEAP project, General Education Maps and Markers, which was funded by the Gates Foundation, so thank you, Dan, for that. I had the privilege of chairing the Equity Working Group. It's a group of scholars, practitioners, and policy experts brought together to examine several key questions related to improving student learning and addressing equity to advance underserved student success. So we asked, as a group of scholars and practitioners, several key questions. What does it mean to be equity-minded? What does it mean to be engaged in equity-minded pedagogy? How can we value and embed students' cultural capital in curricular and co-curricular design? How can we move the dialogue about student learning and success from a deficit-minded approach to an asset-based approach? How can we build the capacity for educators to ask and respond to questions about equity that can lead to campus change? And how do we motivate faculty and staff to address equity as intrinsic to higher education's mission? Those are some of the questions that the group of scholars addressed and we discussed in detail throughout the year and a half that we worked on General Education Maps and Markers. And from that, we commissioned a report from the Center for Urban Education at USC that Estela co-directs with Alicia Dowd, and asked them to write this report on America's Unmet Promise. Here is a copy of the report right here. It's being sold at our pub's desk out front by registration, if you would like to pick up a copy. The first part of America's Unmet Promise outlines the reality of educational inequities that still plague our nation. So I don't need to remind this group of higher education leaders that are all too familiar with the data points that have brought us to where we are today. We all know about the disparities in K-12 system reforms that are the roots of higher education inequity. We know that there is inequitable access to higher education by race and by class, and that there are inequities based on the types of educational experiences that students have. That's why we're here today. That is why we have launched the LEAP Challenge and the Equity Imperative. The need for action from us as higher education leaders is quite apparent. But the point today is not for us to labor over the data, but to use the data to focus and to drive our efforts to help higher education leaders design strategies and system-level and campus-level practices to infuse change. This goal is central to our work at AAC&U, and you will hear more about it throughout the year as we release additional resources to help you in your work to address the equity imperative. So now I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague, Dr. Bensimon, and she's going to discuss the key message and recommendations from America's Unmet Promise. And then she will be followed by Dan Greenstein and Susan Johnson, who are going to be respondents of the recommendations that Estela and her team outlined in America's Unmet Promise. Estela?
Thank you. Thank you, Tia. And hello, everyone. 50 years ago, plus almost one, Lyndon Johnson, right here, for those right there, signed the Civil Rights Act. And in signing that act, he said that its purpose was not only equality in theory, but that it was equality in fact and in results. And that was the promise. 50 years plus one. The images that you see in front of you, even though they are 50 years apart, they are troubling in their similarity. Looking at 1964 and 2014, 2014 in terms of what happened in Ferguson, in New York City, in Oakland. These images suggests that even though 50 years have gone by since the passage of probably the most important landmark legislation, we are still experiencing the conditions of separate but unequal. So I start with those images to introduce our publication, America's Unmet Promise, in order to provide a social and historical and political context for what the unmet promise entails. So I'm not going to present a great deal of data. I'm just going to present some of the basic facts in order to go on to the next section of our report, which is actually fairly practical recommendations on how to enact equity as a practice, as a value. So money is important, and as you can see from this graph, the racial wealth gap has kept on widening since the civil rights era. In fact, for every dollar in assets for white citizens, African Americans have a nickel. Our wealth gap is actually larger than it ever was during apartheid in South Africa. School segregation, despite Brown versus Topeka, school segregation is still widespread. And if you look at this graph, essentially what it shows is that 74% and almost 80% of Latino students are attending public schools that are either highly segregated or intensely segregated. Intensely segregated schools are those where less than 10% of the students are white. So in other words, 90% non-white. And these segregated schools, in turn, have major gaps in per pupil spending. If you look at the longer bar, what it shows essentially that in schools that are 90% white versus schools that are 90% non-white, there's a gap of $733 per pupil spending. Not only that, but for every 10% increase in students of color at a school, there is a $75 decrease in per pupil spending. So what all of this translates into is a truncated curriculum that deprives students in the segregated schools that are also poorly funded and that also have less qualified teachers. It deprives them of the curriculum that they need in order to be able to exercise both access to higher education as well as choice. One of the characteristics of our system of higher education, for which we take great pride, is that we have a diversity of institutions so that students can make choices as to where they go to. But in fact, for African American, for Latino students, for American Indians, for marginalized Asian American populations, the possibility of choice is quite limited in terms of higher education. As a consequence, these students of color, tend to be segregated in two-year colleges. 50% of Latinos are now in community colleges. Almost 60% of Latino students are in Hispanic-serving institutions. They're Hispanic-serving institutions not necessarily by choice, but because of the demographic changes. For African American students, what is most interesting is that the same percentage of African American students who are in private four-year colleges are now in for-profit institutions. 13% of African American students are in for-profit four-year colleges. The growth of their enrollment in these colleges has been unprecedented. These different roads to college also translate into different kinds of attainment. For every 100 public school white children, 31 earn a degree, either at a community college or a four-year college in 3 and 6 years. The comparable figures for African Americans is 13 out of 100, and for Latinos, it's 16 out of 100. In 1964, around then, 94% of the undergraduate student body was white. In 2014, we take great pride in the diversity of our institutions. We celebrate diversity. In fact, in some cases, institutions are so diverse that we may feel that we have resolved the problem. But as I have shown you in these bits and pieces of evidence, in fact, we are diverse, but diversity has not necessarily translated into equity in educational outcomes. In part, so if those of you who heard President Obama speaking 2 days ago, he mentioned, in speaking about Cuba, we have tried this policy for 50 years, and it hasn't worked. So we need to change it. Well, in some ways, the same thing applies to higher education. We have tried for 50 years to address the issue of years and years of exclusion through special programs to facilitate access as well as success for students of color, for first-generation students, also for low-income students. But it really is not working because we are not seeing that much change in terms, we have seen change in terms of access, but not necessarily in terms of what Lyndon Johnson called, equality in fact, inequality in results. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do differently? And one of the things that we speak about in our report is this notion of equity by design. Part of equity by design is that we need to ask ourselves, why is it that our practices do not seem to work in the same way for African American, for Latinos, for American Indians, in the same way that they work for white students? So part of the answer to that is that we have been socialized in higher education to think about success as the responsibility often of students. It's a result of individual effort. It's a result of motivation. And we don't ask ourselves about our practices. We do not think about in what ways our practices might be contributing to inequities. In fact, if you read today's Inside Higher Education, there were reports about a survey that was done recently among provosts. And what's interesting is that 75% of them said that their colleges are doing quite well, that they're being successful. And I think that, not having read the whole study, I think that that's part of our symptom, that we tend not to turn the mirror or the focus towards our own practices. And in order to address the problem of equity, we have to. And to illustrate what I mean by that, I'm going to share with you a brief clip from, it portrays Professor James Gray, who is the chair of the math department at Community College of Aurora in Denver. It is one of the colleges that our center has been working with. And what he's going to talk about is what happened when he decided to ask that question, why is it that the practices that I'm engaged in are not working well? So I would like you to listen to it, and then I'll I'll return to the presentation.
84.6% of our faculty have been white. And so this is one of those moments when the light's shining on you, and you have to be very honest with yourself. And it's a very difficult thing. And do you notice up here, there's a group which is missing, which is African Americans. And when you take a look and you see that in the time you've been department chair, there hasn't been a single African American male who taught college algebra. It's like, are you kidding me? Over 10 years, not a single African American male. And this is the point when it's so biased, it's so improbable that it couldn't have happened almost without the intent of that actually happening. My ability to impact that is the same as somebody who was intentionally not hiring African Americans to teach. So with our part-time faculty, what I was really doing is I was taking a look for people who kind of manifested the things that I saw about myself. So one of those things was experience. Experience was really important. Experience was really important. And what I found out is when I was recruiting those concurrent enrollment faculty, I was recruiting them because they were known, right? The way my colleague puts it is what I was really trying to do is I was trying to stop from any problems from happening for me to deal with, as opposed to recruiting people and actually trying to help them. As far as the full-time faculty go, I thought I had a great strategy for recruiting candidates for full-time faculty. So what I would do is across our 13 community colleges in Colorado, I knew that the department chairs, and I would forward the job postings on to the other faculty, and what I'd be getting is people who are experienced in our own community college system. So I go to our conference last September, and there's about 200 people in the room that are just math faculty. There wasn't a single African American in that room. Again, it was one of those things that's so improbable it almost couldn't have happened without it intentionally been designed to do that, right? So my strategy was providing a disadvantage for African Americans in a tremendous way. So that was one of those things that I had to be very honest with myself. So in terms of recruiting, I have recruited African American faculty since then. One of the full-time positions was an African American faculty. And if you go back to that idea of the question of value, what value do we really want? Deconstructing everything you believe and what the value is, there's a lot of strengths that we completely ignored, that we were completely unaware of because we were kind of living in our own world, right? So the other faculty member that we've hired is a Hispanic, a very young, very inexperienced Hispanic who has a degree in statistics. So we did interviews. We normally do phone interviews. Usually you do about 5 or 6 or 7. This time we did 25, right? We brought in face-to-face. We decided we're only going to bring in 6 because it was so hard to do 25. We couldn't make a decision, so we said we'll go to 10. Okay? And there was that one person who was number 11, let's just bring him in. And he turned out to be the best. He did an extraordinary teaching demonstration. He was doing everything we wanted in terms of success, in terms of expectation, structure, and communication. And by the way, our teaching demonstration was about the first day of class. So they not only had to do some math teaching, they had to show what the structure of their class was actually like. And interestingly enough, our Hispanic candidates came in and they hit the structure thing dead on. And some of our white candidates tended to stand up and just talk about it, and you're flipping through the syllabus that they provided, and it's really hard. So it's really interesting when you change that sense of value, what you really value and what you're looking for. It really changes the world you live in. 84%.
So what you hear James speaking about is essentially examining taken for granted policies that we assume to be neutral, but in fact policies that contribute to the inequalities because they're part of our structures, and they in fact do have race, they do have gender. And one of the things then that we do need to do, like James did, is to begin to examine our practices from the perspective of structural racism. We cannot assume that our practices are neutral and that they work the same way for everyone. So I'm going to turn now to the second part of our report. In America's Unmet Promise, we provide 5 principles by which we can develop equity by design in our institutions to learn how to become equity-minded in the ways in which James spoke about. I should also add that Community College of Aurora is an equity scorecard college. That's a tool that we have created at the center. I'm happy to see that partners or former partners from Pennsylvania are here, University of Wisconsin, Metropolitan in Denver, all of them equity scorecard adopters. The 5 principles build on our experience with the systems of higher education and the tools that we created for them. The first principle is that you have to have clarity in language, in goals, and measures. And we say this because you can't just talk about equity offhandedly or as an add-on. There needs to be an understanding of what equity means in actionable ways, not just as a term that is included in documents. The same thing for goals and measures. You know, we have talked this morning about high impact practices. We need to think about equity in what? Do we want to have equity in who participates, for instance, in those high impact practices? The second principle, which is probably the most important, is this notion of equity-mindedness. And essentially, what's required of us for equity by design is that we have to change our schema. Our schema of normative college going does not work for students who, like the ones that I showed you, go to poor schools, have a truncated curriculum, have a guidance counselor for several hundred students. So as long as our paradigm is that normative paradigm of college going, we will continue to produce inequalities. So equity-mindedness essentially means to be able to recognize structural racism in our institutions. We need to be able to learn that, you know, how students experience certain microaggressions, which are in language and other behaviors. We need to understand, as I have here white privilege, you know, James Baldwin was quoted this morning in the main address, and what he said was, before we can understand the minority problem, we need to understand or define the problem of the majority. And part of that is, you know, the privileges that are gained through whiteness. So equity-mindedness is a shift in schema, because schema is what guides our actions. And this is probably the hardest change to make. It's easy to create programs. It's easy to change things here and there, but to change schema is very, very difficult. The third principle is that in order to obtain equity, you cannot treat all students as if they were the same. In fact, often, in order to produce equity, you have to create inequalities in the distribution of resources. You have to be able to put resources where they are most needed. The fourth principle is the use of data. That we must disaggregate data by race and ethnicity. And let me put a plug here for what not to do, that there is a habit of using this term, URM, and which stands for underrepresented minorities. I recently wrote an essay called The Misbegotten URM. The idea of aggregating all students of color into this URM category hides tremendous disparities across racial groups. So disaggregation of data is extremely important. Let me say, though, that data is not the end-all. If people interpret these kinds of data from a deficit perspective, where the inequalities are blamed on students, then we are in the same place. The purpose of data is to be able to identify the equity gaps and to be able to ask, what is it that is contributing to those equity gaps in our practices, not in terms of the students who we are admitting. How am I doing?
You're fine.
Okay. So, one of the things that I was struck by President Obama's speech was, I don't know if you recall, that when he said to people, try living on $15,000 annual income and see if you can do it. Do any of you remember that part?
Yes.
Okay, so I thought, well, think about if you went to one of those schools where you have a truncated curriculum, where you're socially isolated because of the segregation, where you maybe get to see a guidance counselor for a couple of minutes. I would say, try to be that student and see whether you can navigate our complex institutions of higher education. But that's what we do. We expect the students to come like, the student who comes from South Central Los Angeles, I'm from Los Angeles, and Beverly Hills have had very different opportunities, and we cannot expect that they will both function in the same way. The last principle is that equity has to be pervasive. And one of the reasons why for 50 years we have had such a hard time in solving the equity dilemma is because we have treated equity at the margins. Equity has always been outside of the core work of institutions of higher education. Until we can bring in equity and make it pervasive throughout, it is very difficult to bring about the kinds of changes that we seek with the theme of this conference, which is the imperative for equity. And now I'm going to use my notes for my conclusion. To achieve equity, practitioners like James and others we have worked with at the Center for Urban Education, they must learn to not rationalize inequity as a natural outcome of life circumstances, or to attribute inequity to perceived student deficits. Like James, these practitioners learn to doubt the goodness of their practices, and they learn to ask, why is it that here, at this college, in this department, in this classroom, we are not able to produce as much success for African American, Latino, American Indian, and marginalized Asian American students? Like James, all of us can learn to turn the mirror around and interrogate, as he did, the practices we carry day in and out, and discover the ways in which race, gender, and class are implicated. So I know that many of you may be thinking, okay, so now what? What do I do when I go back to my institution of higher education, to my college? And what I would say is that all of us can learn to become equity-minded. And we can learn from and use tools. And if you are curious about some of these tools, I invite you to look at the website for the Center for Urban Education. We also have 2 books. One is Confronting Equity on Campus, which is probably being sold outside by Stylus. And we have a new book published by Teachers College, which is Engaging the Race Questions. In those books, we provide case studies of institutions like the one Community College of Aurora, like Metro, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that we have worked with. I want to also then mention that tomorrow at 2:45, the Metro team that is sitting over here will be speaking about their experience, which was around the same time as the experience at the Community College of Aurora. In conclusion, I want to give some acknowledgments. The report, America's Unmet Promise, was authored by affiliates of the Center for Urban Education. Keith Whittam, a former PhD student who is now a professor at Temple University. Lindsay Malcolm Pique, also one of my former students, who is now a professor at George Washington University, and my colleague Alicia Dowd, co-director. I also want to thank James Gray, who I portrayed in the video clip, Debbie Hansen, who is sitting right over there, who helped me with my slides and is our senior project specialist. And I also want to thank Carol Schneider of AAC&U, David Paris, Catherine Campbell, who did a fantastic job in editing the paper, and Tia Brown McNair, who made all of this possible, and also the Gates Foundation, who paid for all of this work. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. And for those in the back, there are chairs up front. It just hurts my heart that you all have been standing there for the last 30 minutes, but there are seats available up front. I am Susan Johnson. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion with Lumina Foundation. And for those of you not familiar with Lumina, we are a foundation that is focused on post-secondary attainment and specifically increasing post-secondary attainment in the U.S. to 60% by 2025, what we call Goal 2025. And as part of that, we are focused on, again, what we can do to increase attainment and, more importantly, close attainment gaps. So as a respondent to this paper, what I would say first and foremost is that equity matters. Clearly, what Estela has shared with us and the report has shared with us is that it's not something that can be looked over or not considered in our work. And perhaps more importantly, that equity still matters. And I say that because you may find people on your campus or people in your organizations that indicate that somehow question why we're still talking about race, why we're still talking about inequalities and inequities, because it still exists. It still matters. As Estela pointed out quite eloquently, what we saw in 1964, we still see today. So in looking at, again, today's headlines and understanding where we are as a nation, equity still matters. This piece also reminded me that if you're still considering that kind of idea or that principle that lifting all boats works, if lifting all boats worked, we wouldn't see what we see today. We still see these attainment gaps. We still see a need for, again, special consideration in terms of what we do in our work, our day-to-day work, the attention we give, the intentionality behind what we do. We at Lumina know that we cannot reach our goal of 60%, which is, just by the way, currently is around 40% of Americans have a high-quality credential or degree, and we're trying to get to 60% by 2025. We can't reach that goal unless we actually pay attention to these attainment gaps and to the populations that we need to have increase in terms of attainment. I want to share just a graphic that shows there are 14 states where approximately 46% of the U.S. population lies. And within those states, the population of individuals 5 and under, they're in the majority non-white. So again, among these 14 states, the majority of people in that population are 5 or under are non-white. So in projecting where we are as a nation and where we're going, demographically, we are changing. By 2025, half of the nation's workers, or more than 50 million, will be of Latino descent. These are numbers that you need to care about in terms of what you're doing on your campuses, at your organizations, in your institutions. So I want to point out just some very important things. So these are conversations I've had with colleagues, and I'm sure we've all started when I was in school. And that varies for all of us within this room. But again, if it starts that way, you're already off track. We've heard today that today's student is different, plain and simple. 37% attend part-time, 45% attend a 2-year institution, 36 are 25 and older. 36%, 25 and older. 32% are employed full-time. They're working, they're starting at a later age. They're not coming out of high school and going to a 4-year residential for 4 years. That is no longer today's student. And again, if your remembrance and your framing your work around when you were in school, and it may have looked differently then, but today you need to focus on what today's students needs and where they are academically and professionally. Without intentionality, equity without intentionality is like bread without yeast. It will not rise to the occasion that we need it to, and the importance that we need it to attract effective change in higher education. And again, as Estela mentioned in the report, and if you haven't had the chance or when you get to, definitely go out and purchase. It is about being intentional. It can't be ad hoc. It can't be an afterthought. It needs to be at the center of what we do. And then you need to also take the time to look at ongoing evaluation, look internally and externally at your practices and your policies. And I want to just take a moment to reflect on what we as Lumina Foundation did. We actually went through an exercise where we looked at our work, our partners, and had the Center for Urban Education come in as a consultant and conduct some work with our staff and really take a critical look at how we are portraying our work, how we are portraying what we do, and we've made changes. One was we created a position of Director in Equity and Inclusion. We also have gone through various exercises, training, looking at how we make grants, how we invest. We are endowed. Our finances are based on an endowment, and we actually reinvest. So, looking at who we engage around our financial aspects, our investments, and again what they do. So, just taking a critical look from everything from our staffing, our vendors, our grants, everything. So this exercise was very important to us because, again, if we are asking others to take it seriously, we ourselves need to take it seriously. So that was an eye-opening experience and one in which we are still growing and changing from. And just to give you a sense of where we are, again, in terms of attainment and the breakdown, this is actually based on a report we put out every year known as Stronger Nation. And in that report, we break down not only the attainment rates of various populations, you can actually go to your state and look at your county to see the attainment rate. So this is just kind of the overview of where it was last year, and our upcoming report will probably come out in March and April. But again, just noting where we are and where we want to be, we have to take equity and excellence into account, and knowing that in order for us to reach our goal, they have to coincide. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot talk about quality without also talking about equity. And for us, in terms of what was mentioned prior, being explicit about what we mean, as an organization, we tended to use sometimes those phrases like underrepresented minorities or other kind of lumping of students into one category. So we needed to be more intentional about what we meant by equity, and we developed what we call our equity imperative, by which we talk about recognizing and eliminating disparities, noting that we needed to close attainment gaps for Native American, African American, and Latino students, creating opportunities and resources to empower students for their success, and most importantly, I think, focusing on institutional accountability rather than student deficits. Again, some of the language we use, if you use at-risk students, if you use some of those terms that you'll see in this report, it's about flipping the script. It's about understanding that you need to look at what you as an institution and the practices that are inhibiting student success. For excellence, again, in trying to increase the number of high-quality credentials or degrees, we take a close look at what we mean by quality and making sure that there are multiple ways for students to gain credentials. There are multiple ways, and transparency is key to our efforts as well. So again, learning by competencies. Much of what we have discussed here at this conference, we talk about competency-based education, in which we focus more so on the proficiencies that students have rather than their ability to sit in a chair for 3 hours a week. So again, understanding that there are other ways to consider learning and what that looks like for various populations. Assuring that high quality learning is tied to the workforce and the workforce needs. And then obviously we want it to be affordable. We want a system where, again, no matter where the student comes from, no matter if they're starting with that $15,000 a year, their family income, that you need to take that into account, what that means for their ability to get into and through college. For us, our expectations at Lumina, again, for us to be more explicit, what we took to heart, we need to reflect the change that we want to see in our staffing, again, in our vendors, in our grantees, in any way that we operate, and any type of activities that we have, just making sure that we are a reflection of what we want to see in our partners. And again, embedding equity within our strategies. We have currently 8 strategies, ranging from things around federal policy to state policy, institutional mobilization, a number of just ways in which we're trying to improve higher education. And part of my role is to make sure that we are embedding embedding equity within those strategies. That does not mean that Susan is the equity person for Lumina. I cannot do it all. I will not do it all. My role is to instead provide that context, provide that resource, provide the means by which we can think critically about our actions and what we want to see and be the change that we want to see in ourselves and also in our partners. So again, it is about taking notice and taking examination of what we are doing as a foundation and being very explicit in our work. In terms of our partners, this year we are actually placing stronger equity language in our grant proposals. We've always had an eye and paid attention to the needs of students from various populations, but in our last strategic plan we called out equity more so, and more specifically we are now calling out in our grant proposals and our contracts requests that expectations of our partners that they demonstrate a commitment to racial and ethnic equity. And this is wording pulled directly from our grant proposal now. This wasn't here last year. So now we have wording in our proposal where if you're coming to us, we expect that there is this commitment to equity and that you have somehow shown your commitment, and if not your commitment specifically, maybe the partners you engage, and perhaps, again, being able to describe what it is this work will do to help address the equity issues, and specifically, again, for populations, being explicit to eliminate post-secondary attainment gaps for Native American, African American, and Latino students. We have to be able to call it out in order to make it a difference and a change in what we want to see. So this is something that we've recently instituted and was a direct piece of that exercise of going through what it means for equity within our organization. Future opportunities, I'm going to echo much of what has already been said. Your data needs to be broken down to reflect today's student. Again, first time, full time, if you're not aware, is typically what graduation rates are based upon. Again, many students aren't first time, full time. Many students are part time, coming from other institutions, first generation students. So it's important to know who your students are and what that means and what you're doing for that student on your campuses. Again, competency-based education, there's an opportunity here to really understand if looking at proficiencies rather than a credit hour or some other form of indication of success, if there are other ways that, again, may prove more beneficial or more helpful to share what these populations of students, Native American, Latino, and African American students, are experiencing in higher ed, this is another way to consider how we can then address equity. And then last but not least, expanded pathways, really understanding that there are various ways for students to get into and through institutions and through post-secondary education. And I say institutions because that's what's typically comes to mind, but understand that there are multiple educational providers. And again, in looking at how higher education has changed, it's also looking beyond the brick and mortar, beyond looking through online. There are various other pathways that students choose to gain credentials. And also just being very intentional about your interventions, your services, and supporting students, monitoring their progress along the way. And again, what are you doing to ensure that they are not only getting into, but through their college experience? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dan Greenstein. I'll just be very brief. And to congratulate AAC&U and the authors, Estela and others, for an exceptional report. I strongly recommend that you read it. It provides us with a vocabulary so that we can have a common discussion about equity and equality, and they're different, and how they're related. It provides us with a taxonomy of interventions, a list of 5 principles that are actionable on our campuses. And I have to admit, I was sent my copy the other day, and I read it on the plane coming out here on Tuesday night, and I read through the principles. I blew through the first section because all the data are good, and it's good they're compiled in one place to show how bad the problem really is. It's a little depressing. And then you get to the 5 principles, and I kind of blew through that, pages 27 to 35, because they're sort of obvious. And then the plane lands, probably after doing some more work, and I'm thinking to myself, actually, they're obvious, but the implications are actually quite profound. And I checked into my hotel, and I went to bed, and I woke up, and I thought, crap, that's really hard. So read this report, look at the recommendations, and let the impacts of them sink in over a couple of hours, days. And actually, the takeaway from that is that I began to reflect on the extent of the lift that this is going to require across this industry to address this problem. I mean, it's really hard. And I'm thinking, because it's so hard, what's the motivation to solve this problem, right? Because, we can point to societies which have peaceful democracies, which have survived for years with enormous inequality. And we can point to societies which have survived even without producing at home the workforce that it requires. So our colleges and universities can, in theory, not address this problem, whether from an equity or an economic development point of view, and will be okay. Not an inspiring motivation. So I'm thinking, this is a big lift, so why even look at it? So, a couple of things. Because unless we figure this out, by 2025, 2030, depending on your projections, it's going to be pretty challenging to keep the lights on in this economy. Because there aren't enough rich people basically left to train up to take the jobs that we need doing. Just aren't. I mean, we could import them, I guess. I hope we're not being recorded.
We are.
Oh, dear.
That's all check.
Because when the GIs came home from World War II, there were multiple pathways into the middle class which included secure manufacturing jobs. Those jobs are gone. The last pathway, arguably, into the middle class is through your institutions. Because this industry is heavily subsidized. A third of its total expenditure annually comes out of state and federal funds, taxpayer dollars. And taxpayers demand a level of accountability and should have one. Fourth motivation, because price inflation, and loan debt are going to drive your students, all of your students, to demand more of you with respect of their success, and they should. And they will, and they do, and they are beginning to vote with their feet. Because in higher education, I owe this one to Carol, owing to the complexion of our new student majority, we are uniquely in this country navigating what it means for people to contribute to our evolving pluralist democracy. We are the source of the future of our democracy in how we engage with our students. A sixth motivation, because when it's cheaper to keep a student than to lose one, you'll keep the student. Because keeping the student is probably an easier path than bankruptcy. Bankruptcy doesn't happen so much in higher education, but other bad things can happen as a result of financial calamity. And finally, and probably most important, because this is the right thing to do. So the language of this report is powerful in many places. I'm struck by one particular section which reads, "This nation's systemic failure to provide quality learning to our emerging majority students is not just deplorable, but in the context of the changing demographics, it's recklessly dangerous. Ours is no longer an economy that can skim talent off the top of society. When innovation is a key to survival, economic success requires the development of new talent from all parts of society. The nation is not currently poised to produce that talent." So I commend the AAC&U and its authors for presenting an enormously powerful report, recommendations which are profound in their implications. Read them. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we believe passionately in the wish of our founders that all lives have equal value, that everyone deserves a chance at a healthy and productive life. The bit they don't say is that typically hundreds of millions of people across this world find that a bunch of shit gets in the way of them actually achieving those aspirations, and we work to reduce those obstacles in the U.S. most intensively in education, because we believe, as this report does, that education is a way through which our people can have access to those values that all their lives can have and will have equal value. So thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Implementation is going to be hard. I look forward to the follow-up report on how we measure success.
We have it.
You have it. It's already there. I didn't get sent that one. Thank you.
So please join me again in thanking Estela, Dan, and Susan for their comments, and Estela for your team and the work that you've done on this report. We just greatly appreciate it. And throughout the report, there are questions that your campus leaders can ask each other, the conversations that you can have. And as I mentioned before, AAC&U, this is our centennial theme, the equity imperative. We will be releasing additional resources for you as campus leaders to engage in these conversations that we find are so critical to the work that we need to do as we move forward with the LEAP Challenge. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, please.
My name is Laura Reynolds. I'm assistant dean at the University of Michigan Dearborn, and I something when you were speaking about flipping sort of the language of at-risk students and thinking about this differently. One of the things I wanted to get all of your perspectives on was the very popular push now, at least around me, to define success for persistence and completion as 15 is full-time and 15 and 30, and that full-time has to look a certain way. And I find that sort of in opposition to the way our student body looks. We have more than half of transfer students. Lots of our students are non-traditional. Lots of them are working 40-plus hours in and out of a home. And so I'm struck by the fact that we have this pressure to define this way in these catchy phrases with which to push what success looks like in our minds on students, when in fact that may not be their definition of success at all. So if you have any comments, I would love it.
Go ahead, anyone?
I'll talk about anything. No, I mean, I think actually I'll just amplify your point, which is a great one. I mean, there's an enormous number of reforms that are available to try to address some of this problem, challenge, and we don't always fully understand the implications for different student groups that we serve. And that is super, super, super important that we do that. What's interesting is we say, hey, we know 15 to finish actually works. And the evidence does show that students who are full-time at 15 are going to get through more quickly, those who, and more successfully. But we also need to recognize, wait a minute, that's not possible for 100%. And what do we do about that other 100%? So no, you're absolutely right. And it's true of the things we're doing in DevEd, and it's true of the things we're doing in competency-based education. We need to be super, super smart about where these interventions work, who they work for, and what we do to mitigate the impacts on those for whom they do not work. I think I said that.
Susan, do you want to?
I would just echo those comments as well, and understanding again, I think if you haven't had time to really look at your campus's data and really understand your student, as you have stated, then you're doing a disservice to your students, because it's better about understanding the context in which you are serving and who you are serving and addressing those needs rather than going for the big shiny object that we frequently go for in higher education. So while it may work in one place, it does not mean that it is one size fits all. But again, it's understanding your student and what your practices and your policies mean for those students.
And it seems like based on what you both said, your foundation are going to start asking those questions of us. Yes.
Students are going part-time, not necessarily out of choice, but out of need. And if we want students to be full-time, then we have to change our financial aid and also how we distribute, for instance, work study. So it's not that students want to be part-time necessarily.
Another question? Yes, please.
I'm not sure if this is a question as opposed to a comment. I just recently moved from Pennsylvania to University of South Dakota. As we looked at data, it's kind of interesting because the way the data was looked at South Dakota, which was a little different than using the equity scorecard or the way the Delivery Institute looked, was through regression analysis. When you do regression analysis, that tends to identify what are the major factors that lead to success. It comes out that it's the student's ACT score. It's their entrance. And that's one of these little types of things that I said end up blaming the student instead of looking at how we accepted these students. If you look at it differently, how do you move forward? So there were so much things, I think, in the way you looked at the data, and I'm not convinced that regression analysis can identify half the predictors of success for the student to admit is really the best way to do it. And that's the way it was done. And so that's just a little comment that I'm concerned with.
Thank you, Jim. And one of the pushbacks that sometimes we get when we do the equity scorecard, because we use the entire population and only numbers and percentages, is exactly that. Is it significant? Is it scientifically valid? And I think that part of the work is disinfecting people from the scientific paradigm. We are human organizations, and what works maybe in the medical world, and maybe not always, does not necessarily work in our institutions of higher education. So multivariate analysis is not applicable when we're thinking about student success.
I know some people in the room. Anybody want to comment? Any other questions? Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for enjoying the session with us. Thank you so much.